Hello BookTube. Today I'm going to be reviewing The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. I'm going to start off with the premise of the story and then tell you whether I like it or not. And then I'll pause and let you know that I'm about to move into a spoiler area of the review, so going into further detail. At that point you can decide whether you want to stop listening and if you want to stick around. Janice Hadlow's debut novel looks at the life of Mary Bennet, the overlooked middle sister of the Bennet family in Pride and Prejudice. There's no need to actually read Pride and Prejudice before you read this book. I do think that it's going to lend some extra enjoyment to it. It's certainly going to enhance the story because you're going to get an opportunity to see the same events through the eyes of someone else. So you get a different perspective of Mary and also about her observations of things that are happening around her. You also have some other key scenes that only involve Mary and don't necessarily involve any of the other Bennet family, which is really unusual because we're just used to Mary being a sort of sidebar in the whole of the Pride and Prejudice story, whereas of course being from her perspective she becomes the main character. So while I actually say that it's going to lend some extra enjoyment to the story by having read Pride and Prejudice, I do think it's worth pointing out that if you love plot-driven stories, you might get a little bit irritable with the first third of the book, which, as I say, is going to be a retelling of Pride and Prejudice. If you don't like having repetition for a plot, you might find that there's that hook missing at the start. I like character as well as plot-driven stories, so for me the real hook was actually the character development. But I can imagine that it would be perhaps a slow start for people who do like the story to be fresh and new straight away. So Janice Hadlow very much gives Mary the story that Austen never gave her, and I feel like Jane Austen was really good at creating a caricature of minor characters. And when I say this, then immediately the only characters I can think of are in Pride and Prejudice. So if you can think of other caricatures that Austen's created, do let me know. But from Pride and Prejudice, obviously Mary, Mr. Collins, and Mrs. Bennet. These three characters have their least attractive qualities about them simplified and exaggerated to become a bit of a light entertainment within the novel. The Other Bennet Sister gives us the opportunity to see the character who stands behind the caricature. The blurb for the story highlights that Mary is a character who is very much unanchored, alone within a big family. She is constantly afraid of the criticism of her mother for being awkward and plain. And although she admires her father and would love to have a strong relationship with him, she actually is also really frightened of his sharp tongue and his criticism because she's seen the way that he makes fun of other members in the family, and she's aware that she's also part of that scrutiny. The only person who seems to be free of that scrutiny is Elizabeth. The blurb and the story in Pride and Prejudice also show us that Mary is not part of her sibling groups. The two older sisters pair off together and the two younger sisters pair off together. So in order to try and make herself stand out a little bit more in a positive way, because she's not pretty enough, she decides that she's going to pursue being more intelligent. She really tries. She's always determined. So anything that needs extra learning, she actually puts the most effort into it. And you certainly feel for her when you are reading Hadlow's version. You don't feel for her when you're aware of Jane Austen's version, which, as I mentioned, is a simplified view of Mary, in which she is described as, and I'll look this up, she has a pedantic air and conceited manner. What I liked about Hadlow's story in the first third, where we're getting the whole recounting of Pride and Prejudice from this new perspective, is what sits behind her being presented as pedantic and conceited. And that tends to be something that we've never considered in Pride and Prejudice, which is her crippling self-doubt. The story then moves on to say, within the blurb, Mary has to go on a journey of self-discovery after the death of Mr. Bennet. Now, people who've read Pride and Prejudice will know that it's a long-standing joke that Mrs. Bennet is always afraid that Mr. Bennet will die and Mr. Collins will inherit Longbourn. In this story, he does indeed die, and it's 2 years after the events of Pride and Prejudice. And that is really where Mary's story starts. I really enjoyed this story. I had a lot of compassion for Mary as a character, and I thought that Hadlow managed to actually bring a lot of the old characters back to life. They were very much in character. I have to think of another word, but the characters were in character. They were certainly in keeping with the whole theme and the whole feeling of Pride and Prejudice. The only exception for me would have been some changes with Mr. Collins, which is probably a personal perspective. But overall, I would say this is like 4.5 out of 5 for me. I thought it was a really strong debut novel. I would certainly recommend it as a historical fiction. And I will now be moving on to the spoiler section of my review. So thank you very much if you've joined me this far. I will be going on in 3, 2, 1. Following Mr. Bennet's death, we've got Mary and her mother moving in with Jane. And the Bingleys are very welcoming. They're a very placid couple. But of course they do have Mr. Bingley's unmarried sister living with them. So the unmarried sister of Jane is not welcome by Caroline Bingley. All of the bullying that we saw going on with Elizabeth happens to Mary, but of course we know that Mary does not have Elizabeth's confidence that was so clear in Pride and Prejudice. And that leads her onto her journey of self-discovery. So she goes on to the Darcys, and there again we see how she doesn't fit in, which leads her on to a round trip back to Longbourn, and where she stays with the Collinses. And I think that this is the key area where people have criticised the pacing. So I've noticed a lot of other people who've reviewed it said the book could be cut back by like 10% with extra editing because it felt overlong. I had the audiobook, so I didn't actually feel that it was overlong, and I would really struggle to see how the middle section would be pruned. The start of it can't be pruned because you've got the whole character development, and middle section you've got, it is slow. I agree, it is slow, but you've got more self-awareness happening for her. And we have got her realizing that she can spark an intellectual interest in one other person and unintentionally also spark jealousy in someone else. It is, a revelation for her. No one's ever been jealous of her. No one has ever, until that point, taken any intellectual interest of her seriously or said to her, do you know what, how about you read this? This is a girl who, at 10 years old, decided to stop running around and having fun with Jane and Elizabeth because she's overheard how pretty they look and she doesn't. So she's aware that if they run around, they'll be, called pretty and be told that they have a nice bit of colouring in their cheeks and they look good, whereas she'll be called unattractive, unkempt, and all sorts of other criticisms. So she retreats very much into her mind, which is not a great place for her to be because she seems to be very much actually connected with her feelings originally, until that point where she decides to become something entirely different. And this isn't to say that she's not a thinking person, because she clearly has an aptitude for learning, but most of her learning is actually, for me, pushed by a determination by her feelings towards improving herself. She tries to entirely cut off the feeling side of her in the book, and she becomes someone who comes across really inauthentic and pompous and pretty much rubs everyone up the wrong way. Whereas what's going on the inside that is truly her is actually really kind and good, and you're always rooting for her to actually express it. So, for example, I'm thinking of that relationship she wanted with her father. She takes him so literally when she asks for permission to go into his library and to use the books. And when he says, yes, okay, because Elizabeth's got access, but keep quiet or don't make a noise, she doesn't dare speak to him about, well, which books should I read, Dad? Can you give us a clue? Because no one else is going to give her a clue. And she gravitates towards the books that, unknowing to her, she gravitates to the ones that he thinks are actually pompous. In her mind, he wouldn't have been keeping books that he's not necessarily, admiring of. So with the exception of the history book, she picks people who've got a very authoritative voice, who sound a lot more confident than she will ever be at that point. Those are also all of the authors that her dad would like to ridicule. I thought that Hadlow pulled off that disconnect between Mary and her father really skillfully. And that also foreshadows the way she retreats into her mind. And that for me also again indicates that her natural inclination is her feeling, because she almost goes into a thinking loop. So I think if her natural inclination was towards thought, she'd be able to go in and out of it quite naturally. But she gets sort of like stuck in a thought loop over and over. And the reason I say this is she very rarely acts. And that is why things happen to her rather than her making things happen. And in her imagination, she does all sorts of things, like she imagines talking to her father and saying, what authors should I read? And them having a wonderful conversation about it, which makes it all the more painful when in one of the scenes she actually sees Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet having exactly the sort of conversation that she's always imagined. The greatest criticism for me is actually the middle section with Mr. Collins, and that has nothing to do with the pacing. I actually struggled to imagine Mr. Collins other than he was in Pride and Prejudice, whereas this novel called me to try and see him in a new light as well, in the same way that we're seeing Mary, perhaps to a lesser degree, but certainly in a new light, and I simply struggled with that. I liked the role of Caroline Bingley in this novel. Again, she comes in as the big bully of the story, but where she found Mary a really easy pushover at the start of the novel, she finds a worthy adversary by the time she meets her again. And you get that whole sense of her shock when she also realizes that Mary's confidence and her ability to now move between having a very balanced sort of like feeling and thinking process has made her really attractive to other people. She's still not beautiful, but her personality shines through. And I love that Caroline is so disbelieving that yet again another Miss Bennet might be stealing a suitor away from her. I especially like the twist at the end, which rounded off their relationship. I don't know how you felt about it, but I thought that was, such an apt ending to it. The biggest thing that I was happy about in this novel is Mary's move to the Gardners, because the Gardners are like the Pride and Prejudice therapists. They were there for Jane when Jane needed a change of scene, and they were again there for Elizabeth when she needed respite from Longbourn. So for Mary to go to the Gardners, I was like, yes, this is going to be really, really good for her. And it certainly was. It's all of the things that you imagine it would be, because Mary is very concerned that, once again, she's not going to be welcomed in the same way that her sisters are. But in the Gardners, you've got a couple who accept people as they are, and Mary is family, and they are hospitable and loving and affectionate. And she is pretty much stunned. She doesn't know how to take it for a very long while, and then you see her coming into her own. Yeah, that was really, really poignant for me because of her slow progress over the book and, having already had those intellectual conversations with Mr. Collins in the library. She is actually really comfortable having conversations and intellectual conversations with two eligible bachelors who come to like her for her views and her very unique perspectives on things. And one of them introduces her to poetry. Yeah, I really like that, and that she makes that connection with poetry going forwards, which leads her on to a wonderful journey through Yorkshire. I thought that was brilliant. I say wonderful journey, but did you also have that sense of This reminds me of the ill-fated journey with the two sisters in Sense and Sensibility, where you just think, oh, there's going to be an accident. Obviously, no one was physically hurt, but I kept thinking someone's going to tumble off a mountain, tumble off a hill or something, and I was glad that didn't happen. But I thought Hadlow was really good in sort of channeling that sort of Austen feeling to it. These are entirely my thoughts. Do let me know if you saw things in a different way. As always, if you enjoyed this review, please remember to like and subscribe, and take care.